Hello, so it is July 28th, 2017. We're in Toronto at the home of Ihor Kuryliw, and we'll be doing an interview with Ihor Kuryliw, and the interviewer is Sophia Isayu. The interview is for the Oral History of Ukrainian Canada project. Thank you for doing the interview.
You're welcome.
So we like to start off easy with the first question being, what is your full name?
My name is Ihor Kuryliw. Place of birth is in Sudbury, and 14th of November, 1939.
Okay. And what was it like growing up there?
It was an ideal kind of a situation if you didn't consider the environment, but in terms of the social, it was, I would think, one of the, I would say, perfect places. The city at that time had maybe 90,000 people. It was a mixed population of people of different backgrounds, Ukrainians, Poles, Croatians, Serbs, and a good portion of it was French-Canadian, although we didn't feel very much of the French at that point.
Mm-hmm. And how did your family come to be in Sudbury?
My father came to Canada in 1928, and after going to several places in Canada, I think the first place was Saskatoon when he got off the boat, but he didn't stay there very long, came back to Northern Ontario, mainly because he had friends from the same village, Potochishche in Ukraine, that already had a job, of some kind of a job there. And so he did spend some time in Fort William, present-day Thunder Bay. Then he moved into Kirkland Lake and eventually to Sudbury, where he worked for International Nickel Mines for 40 years.
Mm-hmm. And your mother, where did you meet?
My mother is from the same village in Potochishche. They knew each other a little bit, as I found out later on. My father then brought her over in 1936, 8 years later, for the purpose of getting married. So it was a long-term romance, and eventually produced 3 children.
Okay. And where in Ukraine was that? And can you tell us a little bit about your grandparents as well?
It's very difficult to discuss grandparents. Well, first of all, the area is, as today it's known, is Ivano-Frankivska Oblast. In the old days, it was Stanisławiu. In terms of grandparents, on my mother's side, she grew up basically on her own. Well, she didn't her father disappeared during the First World War, as did my father's father. So both my parents were brought up by their mothers because of the wartime situation, First World War. My father was the oldest in his family. And after my grandfather disappeared during the war, my grandmother took my father out of school in order to get some help to run the family territory, family farm. So that as a result, my father didn't finish very much of school. My mother was able to somehow get to the town of Horodenka. Perhaps it was, no, I don't think it was a city yet. It was a town where she got, I think she finished her equivalent of high school at that point. She had one brother who lived, and I met him in 1965. He passed away much earlier because he ended up with diabetes. On my father's side, he had a brother and a sister. His sister ended up being sent to Siberia because her husband disappeared during the Second World War. I think he was with UPA. The brother lived longer. Again, I met him in 1965 for the first time. In 65, my grandmother was still living, so I did manage to meet her at that time.
In Ukraine?
In Ukraine, yes.
So is she still on the family homestead, or is she?
You're talking grandmother?
You're right.
No. My father was born in 1910, so he's passed away for a long time, and grandmother, of course. No, the homestead now is being run by my cousin's, the late cousin's daughter. She's there basically on her own. Her grandmother just passed away 2 years ago, so she's there. I don't think she's running it. She teaches it in the village school. So there are other people that come around to work the land.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And you have siblings, is that right?
Yes, I have 2 sisters. There's Sonia, who is the older one, and Oksana, the younger one. And they were both born in Sudbury and grew up in Sudbury. And eventually we all went to here at the University of Toronto, because at that point there was no university in the city of Sudbury.
Mm-hmm. And are they here in Toronto too with you?
They live here in Toronto, yes.
Okay. Were either of your parents or grandparents Holodomor survivors?
No. The only Holodomor, if you could make it a little equivalent, was the dirty 30s here in Canada. My father had come in 28, and of course there was that depression, but they managed somehow. He was getting 25 cents an hour for working in a lumber camp, bringing water to the workers. So that were little tough times, but not necessarily Holodomor.
Mm-hmm. And what was the primary reason for the move to Canada?
My father just pulled up stakes and immigrated. There's no family here. Just, I guess in the late 20s, the Poles didn't mind people leaving, I guess, and he just decided to pull up stakes and come to Canada.
And did he need to be sponsored when he came?
No, he just came as an independent. Now I do have a couple of interesting, one interesting situation in terms of distant family. My grandfather, my mother's side, Zabolotny, also looked for a way to make money by coming to different countries and then perhaps going back and helping out his family. Well, one of the countries he ended up in was in Cuba, and he actually did die there. This was my grandfather on my mother's side. We did try to find out, my sister Oksana went to Cuba to look for a possible grave or some connection, and at this point we still haven't found anything concrete. All this is based on a postcard that a friend of his sent from Cuba. He was also there. He sent it to the village, telling about the fact that my grandfather had passed away. Yeah.
How long was he there? Do you know?
Well, you're talking about 1921, 22, right after the war, for a couple of years. We don't know whether he was any other place. Could have been in Canada, went back, because this was happening at that time, just like it is today. People from Ukraine going to Spain, Italy, going back, And
how old would he have been, roughly?
Probably in his late 50s. So.
Okay. So at home in Sudbury, what was the primary languages spoken?
Oh, it was Ukrainian for sure.
Okay. How and when did you learn English?
Probably when I went to elementary school, because it was, I guess street English was okay, because you play and you learn, but officially, everything was basically in Ukrainian.
Did Did your parents speak English at home at all?
Eventually. You remember I mentioned my father coming here when he was 18 years old, having already worked the farm back in the village. And I think he came to Canada knowing neither language. And everything that he accomplished was learned in Canada.
Mm.
Yeah. My mother, as I mentioned, had a little bit more education. She finished, as I said, I think it was the equivalent of a high school there. Eventually, through the help of my father, who was already making some plans, I guess, he used to send over money for sewing courses, not only for her but for other girls from the village. And we do have pictures of those girls who took the course, helped by Vasil from Canada.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what was his full trajectory? What did he do job-wise? Can you trace some of that?
Well, he,
Steps?
other than being a laborer, having a little bit more ambition, he did become a welder. You had to get some kind of qualifications. And especially, it's not just sort of welding a pipe. You had to know how to weld two pieces of metal so that where there's pressure on it and things don't break. So he did learn that, I guess, by taking some courses. And now, other than the fact that he was working for INCO, he's got a long story of being very active in the Ukrainian community, representing the Ukrainian community in the English community. To give you an example of the best, when they were finally moving to Toronto, as it took a couple of years to talk them into coming here, City Council had a special meeting, or a special item on one of their council meetings, to say goodbye to Action Bill. That was his nickname, because they all knew of him as being active in the community. He was a great patriot of the city, and they really made a real effort to say a goodbye. And we have all this on video. Down the line, it'll probably be on the internet. My sister and her husband are presently finishing a video of his life and contribution to the community.
So what kind of community involvements did you have?
Well, he always wanted to show that the Ukrainians were, to quote, a Mr. Somebody, and tried to show the best parts of the Ukrainians. And he had contacts with several service clubs, Kiwanis and Rotary, and he would get us to, well, I say us because I did belong to a dance group, and we would normally, a lot of times, perform at some of their dinner meetings to show off the Ukrainian aspect of the city. Mm-hmm. You know, he represented the Ukrainian newspaper Novy Shlach, today called the New Pathway. He collected ads for the newspaper in Sudbury, and he did have a claim to fame there. When there were the Christmas and Easter editions, for which they tried to collect ads from everybody in the city, here in Toronto, or Winnipeg. I'm sorry, the newspapers got its origin in Winnipeg, eventually transferred to Toronto. He had more ads than all the other sections in the newspaper. And there were no Ukrainian businesses there. Oh. So he managed to talk the business people into advertising the Ukrainian newspaper.
In Sudbury.
You know, in Sudbury, yeah. A lot of them thought it was a local newspaper, but it wasn't. He didn't push it too hard. But that was his claim to fame in the city. This is why he got to know a lot of people in the city. He would try to get people to bank in the banks where the manager gave an ad. So the managers were quite happy with that kind of thing. So that was his, as I said, his claim to fame, called Action Bill. Okay. He sold a lot of lottery tickets for different causes, some of them being Ukrainian, some being otherwise. So he had a reputation as being a do-gooder from that end of it too. You know.
Clearly a good salesman.
So this is the kind of atmosphere we grew up in the house. My mother was a housekeeper, homemaker, so to speak. Stay-at-home mom, as one would describe it today. She was active in the women's organization, both in the kitchen and on the executive side of it. My father never was on the executive. He was always sort of representing the organization, the Ukrainian National Federation, on the with the English community. He had good connections with the mining company. Even though he was so-called just a welder who sometimes walked to Fruit Stobie to the mine, because we didn't have a car at that time. But he managed to make contact with the vice president of the mining company in Coppercliff, where the headquarters were. Again, he always wanted to show that there was the Ukrainians were good workers, and when the Uno Hall was being renovated, I don't remember what year it was, around 1960 or thereabouts, International Nickel gave a substantial donation to the renovation, and all because of Action Bill and his efforts. You know. So Ukrainian atmosphere at home. There was no such thing as a helicopter mom because we walked to the hall. This is why the city was nice to grow up in. Basically, you were walking. Not everybody was walking distance. There were people who lived farther away, but we managed somehow to have no problem with that. Ukrainian school, Ridna Shkola, one day, dancing the next day, choir the third day, something else the fourth day. On Saturday, Sunday, usually a concert. So there goes your whole week, keeping you off the street.
Yeah, so very involved, yeah, okay.
Well, and then, of course, I took violin lessons. My sisters were taking piano. I did play in the local public school orchestra and eventually in something called the Sudbury Symphony. So there was a lot of activity going on.
Okay, I'm going to get back to your music skills in a minute. Let's just go through schools. Where did you attend elementary, high school?
Well, it was in Sudbury, Lansdowne Public School, and then we moved. So then I went to College Street Public School and then Sudbury High School, and up until 1958. Then I came to Toronto, at University of Toronto. I took modern history, well, history. I took a 4-year degree.
And that became your profession?
Well, it became sort of indirectly, yes. At that point, I wasn't planning. There were no plans, basically, at that time about careers. Eventually, yes. Then I went into OCE, Ontario College of Education, and ended up teaching for 7.5 years.
Okay. And what kind of a student were you?
I had to work hard for everything that I achieved.
Okay. But you did well because you became the head of the history department, yes?
Well, that could be strictly by luck. Yeah, eventually when I went to Sudbury, to teach. Things were expanding quite a bit in the province. High schools were being built. Premier Davis, or actually he was just Minister of Education, was spreading a lot of money around. So because of the expansion, I became a department head in history within 3 years of starting to teach. So that was quite good.
That's a fast track.
Yeah.
And Ridna Skala, you went, was that a Saturday school?
No, it was during the week school.
During the week?
I can't remember which day of the week, Tuesday or Wednesday. I don't know why that was the case, but somehow we managed. I think it was from 6 till 8 or 7 till 9, that kind of thing.
And did you go willingly? Did you have no choice in the matter?
I think I was okay. I don't recall ever being a problem for my parents over any particular issue. So I guess it was okay. I don't sort of remember having any big problems at that stage.
And what did you learn most from Ukrainian school? Remember?
Too far back.
Too far back.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, I wouldn't, learning your alphabets and your language and whatever else, but being very specific, I don't really know whether it had anything special on the thing.
Okay. Did you ever feel discriminated against due to your ethnic background?
No, as I mentioned previously, Sudbury was a real mixed bag of ethnicities. And when I went to high school, I mean, I had to spell my name 100 times until people did learn Ihor, meaning Ihor. Most of my friends called me Ike, I for I, K for Kuryliw, and just to keep it short,
Mm-hmm.
But no, there was no problem. The teachers that we had were mostly Anglo-Saxon at that time, and I never felt anything specific about not wanting, because they were handling other ethnic kids too. It wasn't just me there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And did you have therefore lots of non-Ukrainian friends?
Yeah, well, because of that Ukrainian, our activities in the Ukrainian community, that's pretty, that took up most of my time. So to sort of spend time somewhere else wasn't necessary, quote. We did have a junior soccer team where we couldn't get enough kids of Ukrainian background, so we had a mixed bag. I know there was a Serbian kid, Italian kid, So Poles had their own team, so they weren't involved. So there was no sort of business of discrimination with other kids,
Okay. And what Ukrainian youth organizations did you belong to?
Well, the only game in town at that time was Ukrainian National Youth Federation. It was the youth wing of UNO, Ukrainian National Federation. It was either that or belonging to the church youth group. So somebody opted for me that basically I was in the youth group, although I was an altar boy for 7 years at the church, but not necessarily getting involved with sort of the youth group.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And can you describe the influence of UNO on you?
Well, in terms of the sort of next level organization, no. UNO was rather unique in the sense that there was a youth group, or MOON as it was called. They helped us a lot, but they didn't get mixed up in our affairs very much. So that basically it's an anomaly in the sense that you've got 16 and 17-year-olds running an organization basically on their own. Now, what they do would have an advisor as being part of the organization, but it was good in the sense that right from the start, you were getting experience on how to run an organization. You know, president being president, a secretary, a treasurer, whatever else. So from that end of it, it was a good experience.
And did you have a position?
Well, I think the first time I got elected was I think I was a treasurer, and eventually I became president, you know, down the line. I don't remember what year it was, but, you know.
And did your family belong to a particular church parish?
Well, I was a Ukrainian Catholic church at that time.
Do you remember the name?
St. Mary's, okay. Yeah. And then St. Mary's also had a camp at a lake. And I was there 2 or 3 times during the summers, where I ended up also as being some kind of a leader. I got some kind of trophies. I remember looking at some pictures, so for whatever reason, I don't know, maybe just for keeping out of trouble.
And keeping others out of trouble. Okay, and then do you currently belong to a particular church parish?
Sort of 50-50. I grew up as a Catholic, and as I said, I was an altar boy for 7 years. But now, being married to Valentina, who tends to be a little bit more religious than I am, I'm tending to follow her into the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. If we go to church, that's where we go. Not that I try to avoid anything else. Growing up in Sudbury, again, it's one of those unique situations where the organization, UNO, never made any distinction between religions, so that we grew up as pretty ecumenical and had no problems with kids going to different churches. You know, I thought that was that's a superior way of growing up, and I always felt that way. And even the fact that I married Valentina, Ukrainian Orthodox, and I don't know, I gotta give her credit because she made a Ukrainian Catholic. We did have a bit of a hassle on either side before it happened, but 47 years later and counting.
Congrats. So to what degree has your religious upbringing influenced your life?
I don't think it has, even though I did spend time as an altar boy and knowing all the answers to the priest's prayers and whatever else. If I have any ethics at all, it's just general, not necessarily specific. If anything religious, it's turned me more towards the art involved with religion and anything else. But if you're thinking of ethically, then I don't think it did much for me in either way.
Okay. And in university, did you belong to any university student clubs?
Well, this was again an interesting situation. When I came to Toronto in '58, since I was an organization man already in Sudbury, I drifted over to the Students' Club, which had existed at that time. And within a year, I was on executive. It was an interesting period because we were taking over the club. I'm saying the guys my age.
Your age, yeah.
We're taking over the club from the group of people more senior. These are the people that came to Canada after the war, worked for a while, and went back to university. So where we were in our 20s, they're already in their 35 plus. So it was a little different generation. But it was an interesting time because we were sort of still there. And so to this day, I know people that were at the university along with me, although they're much older than I am, or some of them have passed away already. You know, so yes, I joined the club and then eventually became an executive. And then Uh, I was the vice president and then president of the club.
And were you involved in any kinds of activities during that?
Well, now, as I said, with my background with the Ukrainian dancing and singing and everything else, I managed to talk the executive into doing the same thing in the students' club. We had our own dance group. It was run by orthodontist Dr. Ihor. We had the best choir in the city, about 100. We had studente and we had others that were not students that came to the choir. So it was a really great time. But I attribute this partly to my own background because you see a lot of the people grew up in Plast who don't necessarily, at least at that time, never pushed the folklore aspect of being Ukrainian. So to this day, I sort of marvel at how this small town guy came to Toronto and managed to talk them into organizing groups. And it was to the great benefit of the students because they got to know each other. You know, it was a big social aspect to it, you know. So, yes, that's the story.
Yeah, and certainly that was gone by the time I was a student at University of
Yeah.
Toronto. Okay, so let's talk about that folkloric history. Violin, dancing, you're also a bandura player. So can you tell a little bit about who taught you, how that came, how much you were involved in it, where you...
Well, okay, the violin part, that was just straight lessons, you know, putting my violin on my bike. My father made me an iron thing that I attached to the bike, and there I bicycled over to my lesson. That violin, it was a good time. Again, it was one of those, I had to plug a lot. There was a little bit of talent, mostly plugging. But it came in handy. As I said, I played in the Sudbury Symphony. When I went to university, I ended up here at U of T Symphony. At that time, the quality wasn't the same as it is today, but it was still okay. Eventually, I lived in Kingston. That you can ask me later on. Played in the Kingston Symphony, so violin part of it was. In terms of music, or at least other instruments, Sudbury had a militia band where my father played trombone. And being a dutiful son, he asked me whether I'd like to come and play in the band. I said, well, I don't know what I'm going to be playing. He says, well, there's something called an alto horn. So I ended up learning the alto horn and playing. Again, that came in handy, because when I came to Toronto, I joined the Blue and White Marching Band, the official band of the University of Toronto, that traveled with the football teams to various locations. And eventually I became a business manager of the band itself. So the music, and then again in Sudbury, started singing the tenor part, and to this day I still sing. Sang in the Students' Club choir, and then eventually here in Toronto we had an opera chorus, of which I again was sang in a tenor part.
And the bandura playing?
Bandura, that's a long story. In 1954-55, my parents sent me to Kuryliw. That's it's a resort owned by the Ukrainian National Association, which is at that time was an insurance company. And they ran summer courses, 2-week summer courses during the summer. And my parents sent me there. I ended up going 3 times. But the second summer, I met Miroslav Dziakowski, who at that time was living in New York, and who was interested in the bandura because he had a bandura meister, a teacher. His name was Dr. Stokolko in New York. So Miroslav learned something about the bandura from him, and he wanted to show what he knew to others. So he would come to Kuryliw on the weekends and show us something about the bandura, but mostly he came up with a scheme of making fast, cheap banduras, basically made out of paper mache. Okay. Okay, the whole idea was to get, an instrument that had a bottom to it and something that you can attach a frame to, string 20, 30 strings on it and play. He had brought over a half, sort of a plaster of Paris mold on which we got newspapers, glue, until we ended up with basically about a half an inch. Then you tighten this thing up, and overnight it would dry, and next morning you would have a bottom. Okay. That then we attached to a frame, and then we put the strings on, and we played Zapovit at the end of the course. We did this within the week. Anyway, so that was the beginning of my interest in the bandura. Miroslav was then, he was working for Radio Liberty at that time. He was transferred to Munich. But we still kept contact. He was still coming up with different schemes on how to make banduras quickly and cheaply, so to speak. He trying to get as many people to play as possible. It's our Ukrainian national instrument. I had a godfather, Yosef Vishnyovsky, his name was, who was a carpenter by trade. Not just the house builder, but he did fine work. So I showed him these plans, and I said, well, Miroslav's sending me these things, let's give it a try. So he built my first bandura. The bandura didn't last too long, mainly because we didn't put enough struts inside. When you put 40 strings across a piece of wood, there's a lot of pressure. So the thing basically did fall apart eventually. But then, as time went on, Miroslav kept sending me these plans, so we kept trying to get bigger and better banduras. Then when I lived in Sudbury, when I moved to teach, and then I had another friend who, again, wasn't a carpenter, but he liked woodworking. So I showed him the plants, and he also made 3 of them. So eventually I ended up with a little group in Sudbury, and there was three bandura players, I and the other 2 chaps. Actually, it was 4 of us, and 2 or 3 that sang. So I had a little group there with the bandura there. Actually, that very first bandura that I spoke about, I think my friend Ihor and I were probably the first bandurists in the city, because we performed in 1961 at a Students' Club concert. Now, I don't know if anybody's tracked what's happened, but later on other groups formed, but we were there in 61, the 2 of us, along with another group that I organized to sing.
You're talking about in Toronto now?
In Toronto, when I became part of the Students' Club, yeah. Yeah. So, in terms of chronology, Miroslav kept sending me these plans. My godfather made me this bandura. That's the one that I played in 61. It lasted about 2 years before it finally collapsed, Now eventually, with the bandura, Stefan Dominic, the one that made the banduras in Sudbury, made a bandura that was purchased by the National Museum in Ottawa. I had a friend there, Bogdan Klemash, who was a folklorist at that time and at the museum, and he saw an opportunity to have a Canadian-made Ukrainian instrument. I understand there's other Ukrainian banduras now, other than that one there, but I think we were probably the first ones at that time. Mm-hmm. You know, so I have encouraged a couple of people to do the thing with the banduras.
And the dancing?
Well, that's you know, that was sort of a normal thing one did in Sudbury. Almost everybody belonged to the dance group. You know, we had different talents. It wasn't. I don't think we were as good as some of the groups that you have here in Toronto anymore. We weren't professional. I remember meeting Avramanko, who was going across Canada and having these dance classes and whatever else. So I'm a sort of a graduate of his school from way back when. You know, when I came to Toronto, I didn't, other than at weddings. That's about all. You know.
So, between all of those instruments, did you have one that you were fondest of?
Well, no, I think the violin was probably the most important. With the bandura, I always, in my more cynical moments, say that Ukrainians complicate their life. To dance Ukrainian dance, you have to almost be an acrobat, athletic. To play a bandura, an instrument that had 60 strings, you have to grow fingernails, and if you don't have fingernails, you have to get fake ones. Complications, you know. So I'll stick to the violin.
I see. Okay. And the voice. I know you and your wife are big operas.
Well, I've sort of half retired now on with the tenor, but tenors are always in short supply. So anywhere I go, whether church choir or otherwise, and especially if you can read music, which I can do well, I can still put in a few little words, you know.
Mm-hmm. Can you describe also your job or career history? Well,
I did, as I said, I taught history for 7.5 years, and then in 1973 I was given an offer by a chap here in Toronto, Markian Kohut, to become a partner in a travel agency. By that point I had done quite a bit of traveling on my own, and I guess part of that led me to hope or thinking that I could get into business and make a living out of being in a travel business.
Mm-hmm. And what was the name of the travel agency?
The name was Bloor Travel Agency, named after one of the longest streets in the city of Toronto.
And did you make a living there?
Okay, I managed 40 years, 25 of which I was a partner with Markian. He he came to Canada after the war, and he had enough entrepreneurial spirit to get involved. After driving transport trucks for 5 or 6 years, he worked for a travel agency, and then eventually decided to go out on his own. And here I was, a university graduate, former teacher, department head, joining his company. So, and we managed as a partnership for, as I said, a little over 25 years.
Mm-hmm. And then you took it over.
And then I bought the company, his share, and I ran it for another 15 years.
And pretty much every Ukrainian and a whole bunch of others use Bloor Travel Agency to go.
Well, basically there were, at that time, there were 3 agencies that handled the Ukraine travel. We sort of competed. Basically, with each other, but we all got along. The one agency was more left-wing, so they would handle their group of people, and then Astro Travel and Bloor Travel handled the other side.
Mm-hmm. And to what degree do you consider yourself part of the Ukrainian-Canadian community?
Well, it's easy now. You don't have to explain. Well, they ask you your name, where it comes from, and then they'll nod, and no problem. There were times where you would mention your name, and you say it comes from Ukraine, and of course they would know where that was. Or if they related to my first name, they would say, well, isn't that like Ihor? And of course I have to get into my long and winded explanation of where the difference lies between my name and the other name. I feel much more comfortable now, even among Polish, because there were times where we didn't get along, and even in Canada, I think every once in a while there were. I remember in Sudbury, even though I did say that we were a mixed group of people. I know when the Ukrainian Tridents, the soccer team, played the Polish Eagles, White Eagles, there was lots of problems, or there could have been. I don't think that's what happened today.
That's sort of more with the Canadian community. What about within the Ukrainian Gramada here in Toronto or in Canada?
Yeah, other than just being an observer, I'm not very active at this point. I still do belong to Ukrainian National Federation, but I'm not. I haven't taken any great positions there. In terms of whatever's happening, I get quite a bit of information from my wife Valentina, who is active in many ways. So I often introduce myself as Mr. Valentina.
Okay, and do you consider yourself to be Ukrainian, Canadian,
I went through a little change. I used to say Ukrainian Canadian, but now that Ukraine is on its own, I tend to say Canadian Ukrainian. You don't have to explain the Ukrainian part of it, because people will, I think, relate to Ukraine as it is now.
Okay. And can you describe your general overview or opinions of the Ukrainian-Canadian community's dynamics?
I think the fact that we've got a nice young group of people that are running our major organizations like Ukrainian Canadian Congress and the Ukrainian World Congress. Now that's very positive, and I'm very proud of that. The Shevchenko Foundation is doing amazingly well. Again, I know Andrei Holodishevsky's been there for a while, and so from that end of it, it's great. Every once in a while, I do have issues about one or two of the organizations that tend to want to take over from the general organizational structure that we have. But there's not much, I mean, I'm not going to do anything about that. It's just an issue that I have.
Okay. And to what degree are you interested or involved in current affairs in Ukraine?
Well, as much as reading the newspaper, and I have having family there still. So from that end of it, it's still important. Ukraine has had its ups and downs. It looked for a while that you didn't have to help them out financially or otherwise, but that certainly has changed in the last couple of years. So from the point of view of the fact that I have family, and Valentina and I have close friends there, She's got family that I've gotten to know. And then plus the fact that we associate with people in Kyiv and Lviv who are involved in art and education.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
So have you traveled often to Ukraine over your lifetime?
Well, being in the business, when Ukraine was still part of the Soviet Union, there was only one way of getting there, and that was through going through something called Inturest, which was the official travel agency of the Soviet Union. And Inturest had a procedure where they wanted somebody to accompany a group. No, I should step back a moment. There were very few people who managed to go to Ukraine to visit family. The only way you would get to visit family unofficially was to go as a tourist. And to go as a tourist, you were limited to 4 days in each city that you went to cities that were actually open. There were one or two that were closed. Ivano-Frankivsk being one of them. This was the city where would be the closest to where my family is. So Inturest wanted an escort to bring the group over and to be with the group while you're there, not to have any input about what's going on, but at least to travel with the group. So as a result, I did go several times on that basis. But I did go there the first time was in 1965 on my own. There weren't that many people going, either tourists or visiting family, but I managed somehow to, well, as long as you pay, you go as a tourist. So I did spend 3 weeks there, being in 7 different cities. And it was an interesting situation because Inturest ran your life while you were there. When you arrived at the airport, they met you, brought you to your hotel. They knew which hotel you were supposed to be at. They would organize the tours, because that's what it was all about. After 4 days in the first city, they would bring you to the train station. When you arrived in the second city, there was somebody right at the door of your wagon, because they knew exactly where you were supposed to be. Brought you to the hotel, showed you tours. So it was one of those things. But in '65, I insisted on having a guide either in English, who spoke English or Ukrainian. They did have a problem a couple of times in both languages. They didn't have too many Ukrainian speakers in some cities who they would want to send to meet a foreign tourist. So I did have some English speakers, and then mostly Ukrainian. Okay. But they had a little problem with me because they thought it was a Canadian passport. They saw that I was born in Sudbury, in Canada, and still spoke Ukrainian. That sort of threw them for a loop a little bit. Now my Ukrainian was probably a little bit better than it is even today, because I'd spent the year previous, I'd spent with Radio Liberty in Munich, learning Ukrainian. I would speak into a tape. I would read something into a tape, and then one of the staffers at Radio Liberty would then correct my pronunciation and put in proper accents. So here, a year later, I was in Ukraine, and wanting everything to be in Ukrainian.
Mm-hmm. You know. So, and then when did that change, the Inturest having to take you around everywhere, in terms of how many times you've gone to Ukraine? And
well, that didn't change until Ukraine became independent, 1990, 91, when the whole thing was falling apart. Okay. You know.
And I know that Valentina went to Ukraine about 16 years in a row or so. Did you accompany her every time, or?
No.
No.
No, I think we met once out of that, but that's because she was there with our children, you know. And because I was there with a group, so we just saw each other for half an hour, and that was it for the visit, you know. No, she went basically on her own, and I would meet her in different places in Europe.
And you did visit family, otherwise you did get around to see?
Well, in '65, I managed to get into the village, officially. And this is how it was done. One of the cities that you could go to was Kuryliw. And Kuryliw was about basically an hour and a half to 2 hours ride into the village. Village being near Snyatin. Anyway, so when I arrived in Kuryliw, I requested from Interest whether I could, because my grandmother was still living at that time. So I requested on a sort of humanitarian basis whether I can go and visit her. And I'd never seen her, you know, that kind of thing. So they put in the word to somewhere to find out whether it's okay for a Canadian guy to go into an oblast which is closed to tourists, you know, that whole oblast. So I waited and waited. Well, the thing is, how, you know, you only got 4 days, so you can't wait too long. But on about the third day, no, I guess maybe the second day, late, I got the word that I could go the next day, because on the fourth day I was already leaving. So they gave me a guide and a driver, and we went to the village. And well, I was sort of a bit of a sensation. I was the firstborn Canadian. Now, the other thing is that my father, had left in 1928. This is '65. But he had a good reputation in the sense that he sent money for the local library. I think there's a wayside cross somewhere that he contributed money to. Of course, my grandmother was a pretty tough cookie, and she knew about my father, and so that when I came to the village, I was, Vasilya sempre Ihor selo, and a lot of people just wanted me to cross their puri, as they would say, just to say that I was there,
Yeah, you look like your father too, right?
Yeah, well, a little bit, I guess, maybe less then and more now. So the guide that was with me didn't bother me at all. She just sat somewhere and waited for me to finish up my travels through the village. Eventually I met the Kuryliw kolhosp, the one that was the head of the kolhosp. He was anxious to see me also. So we had a meal at his house with all the other guys that were running the kolhosp, I made a mistake there because we were drinking toasts, as they do in Ukraine. And as I don't know which one it was, third or fourth or fifth, I was going to toast him and his work. So I used the word pane holovo. Well, the word pan was never used under the Soviet Union because that's a pejorative, bad word. And he brought it to my attention that he was not a pan. So I think I named him after his patronymic, Vasilyevich or Mykolaievich or whatever. And I apologize for calling him a pan.
Okay. And how was it meeting your grandmother?
Well, that was very emotional. It's the fact that you haven't seen anybody previous to that. Somehow it's so long ago, so far away, that you're emotional. But it's where you see a little bit of your father in the mother, and I guess a little bit of the character was there too, because he was pretty tough in a way, you know. But that's all I can say about that one. And then there was, of course, the rest of there were aunts and uncles. Some came from other villages. Others came that were distant, that wanted to see me. They knew that I was coming in. I don't know how they knew. This is the interesting part, that with no internet and no Gmails or whatever else, they certainly found out very quickly that I was coming in. You know.
Travels fast. And you were how old at this point, roughly?
65. Well, I was, I guess, about 36 years old, you know. Yeah.
And did you get to see her again? Did you get to see them all again?
Yeah, I managed another trip similarly, but it was in Kuryliw. It wasn't back in the village anymore. It was just too complicated to get permission, and you know, and I was involved with the group at that time, so it's just, you know, and that was basically it. Yeah.
Okay, so you are married. We know
Yes.
your spouse is Valentina, and I wanted to ask about your children. Who are they?
Well, the older is Petro. He's living here in Toronto. He was on his own for a while as a business. Now he's also on his own, but as a handyman installer. Uliana graduated from McGill and eventually ended up marrying an American and now lives in Seattle. Yeah.
And they have children?
Yeah, Uliana has a daughter, Nina. So basically we have one granddaughter.
And did you speak Ukrainian with them at home?
Yeah, similarly to our growing up, they didn't start learning English until they went to kindergarten. I don't think it's done them any harm, although a lot of times people think that there's a problem, but I don't think so. Yeah.
And you, I guess, did all the Ukrainian traditional Christmases?
Yeah, we try to stick to the, Valentina especially likes to do the Rizdvo, the Christmas traditions, and tries to invite family and others that don't have family to come over and partake.
And are they active in the Ukrainian-Canadian community today?
Peter is not, as far as I know, but Uliana is involved with the Plast group in Seattle, because she grew up in, actually both of them grew up in Plast here in Toronto. You know.
And how has being a parent changed you?
Luckily, I have a short memory. I really don't. I really just don't remember. Valentina is the one that brings it up often. You know, what you did there, what you did there. I think I was okay as a parent. Probably a little harder to get along with than Valentina was. I was maybe more the disciplinarian than Valya, rightly or wrongly. I don't think we abused our kids in any way, so if that was the question, that's no. Well, you know, both of them took Suzuki violin, and that was my job. Patra took it for much longer, and he was very talented. He was more talented than I was in terms of the initial. The Suzuki method is you learn by listening and remembering, and he was very good at it. He could play the Vivaldi A minor concerto. He played the first movement when he was 10 years old, and I played it when I was 18 doing my grade 9 conservatory. So anyway, but he didn't continue it, so that's. But I think it helped him a lot. There's a discipline involved in terms of practicing and whatever. So this is where I'm saying I was more the disciplinary because I had to get after them. Uliana also did the Suzuki, but she didn't do it for very long. Somehow, Valya was going to be the Suzuki mother, but both of them retired early. You know.
And what was the happiest moment in your life together with your wife?
Well, finally getting married.
Finally? It took a while?
Well, it took. Yeah, it took 3 years of competing.
Okay.
So, no, that was, you know, that's the moment.
Mm-hmm. And do you have dreams for your children?
Well, the dream being, I think I had a relatively good life, you know, at the age that I am now, and hopefully that things will continue. I often think that I don't know if I want to be growing up at this time, at their age, or even younger. The world is really crazy. Mm-hmm. So I'm just hoping, with my fingers crossed, that things stay normal and they have as good life as I did.
And do you have a basic ideology or principle by which you've led your life that you could share?
Well, without being funny, do unto others what you want to be done to you. Generally, even though I've sort of, you know, had the education plus, you know, running a business, I never try to take advantage of people, even people who were working for me at the time. I never used the word boss. I don't like when people called me a boss or referred to me as that. So that's just generally. If somebody comes into the house to do some work, I appreciate them as I would, you know, because they're the experts, and just because I'm a little different in terms of background, I don't try to make anything of it, you know.
Mm-hmm. And what would you consider to be your greatest life achievement?
At this stage of the game, because I really haven't been active in, you know, in any particular way for the last, say, 15 years, I can only relate to things from way back when, and which is not, I don't think it's the good way of doing it. It's, at least I'm not answering your question. So basically I can't answer the question because I don't think I did anything that's very significant lately. And as I said, from way back when, I don't know if it matters anymore.
It always matters.
No.
It's still part of you.
You know.
Okay.
Well, I'll tell you, perhaps, just to go back, when I was teaching, along with, no, but just by the way, for the record, Valentina and I were in the same department in history in Sudbury, and I was the head. Mm-hmm. I'm not using the word that I said I wasn't going to use. But my department never felt that I was any kind of so-called boss, and it worked to my detriment once or twice, where I didn't realize that one of the... I always felt that once you're a teacher and you're a professional, you do your job because it's your job. But there were a couple of times over the 7 years that I got caught in the sense that I didn't realize that somebody wasn't pulling their weight. And it had to be brought to my attention that somebody's not doing so-and-so. So, now while we were teaching, we did set up a course in grade 12, which was a unique course. It was even wasn't even listed in the curriculum, And I don't know how the principal got around us, allowed us to teach it the way we did it. But he saw that the good part of it and allowed it. It was a grade 12 course which involved the American, Chinese, and Russian revolutions. And we ended up talking a lot about the Soviet Union and whatever else. So any student that took our course in grade 12 would be very well aware of what's going on in the world and what happened with the Soviet Union and the way the whole thing fell apart. That, I think, was a claim to fame on both our parts. The other issue is that when I was president of the Ukrainian National Youth Federation, the National Federation, I did travel across Canada a couple of times where I had to speak to, well, kids that were just a few years younger than I was. And I had to inspire them to be Ukrainian and think Ukrainian and not to be proud of Ukraine. Because in those days, you're talking about late 50s, early 60s. There was, especially in Western Canada, there was a tendency of trying to get away from being Ukrainian. And there were a couple situations where I came across where I think I helped somebody sort of think themselves as making a contribution by being Ukrainian. You know.
And what are you proudest of in your life?
Well, as I mentioned before, at this stage of the game, I don't really have anything I could think anything special.
And do you own any family heirlooms or objects that symbolize your identity?
Are you thinking? Well, the fact that I haven't touched it for how many years, you know, at this stage of the game, and then there are bandurista around that have done much more than I have. So, and it's history, and nobody knows about it. So it's really not that significant, you know.
Now I want to ask you one more question. We have a very beautiful portrait of you in the background there on the couch. Can you tell me how that came about, how that happened, who drew it?
Well, it's again, it's one of these long stories where you have to start with one thing and end with another. As I mentioned previously, Valya and I have some pretty close friends in Lviv especially, who are involved in the art world. And all this came about in 1990, where we met here in Toronto, a sculptor. His name was Roman Romanovich, who then introduced us, when we came to Ukraine, introduced us to his art friends. Well, artist friends. One was mostly they were painters. He was a sculptor among them. There was somebody who did wood carving. So one of them was Oris Skop. He was a painter, and he was involved with a museum that was just being renovated in Lviv, dedicated to Solomia Krushelnitska, who was a soprano who sang the first version of Puccini's Madame Butterfly. I say the first version because Puccini had written the opera and it was panned by the critics, so he had to make some changes to the opera, and she was the one that sang the first new version. Anyway, she was from Lviv, who had married an Italian. She graduated from Italian music school, and Skop was trying to, and having lived in Lviv in an apartment, they managed to talk the local authorities into granting, into letting that apartment stay as a museum for Solomia Kuryliw. And Skop, being an architect by background, was involved in the interior design of this. And they had an opportunity. There were a lot of people leaving Lviv at that time for one reason or another. And there was an opportunity to buy a chandelier, which was similar to the one that was in Krushelnitska's apartment. And they were getting it for a pretty good price. And Skop asked me whether I could maybe make a contribution towards that chandelier. Well, for some reason I had a few dollars in my pocket at that time, and I contributed the money to the thing. And the rest is history. The museum exists today. It's been there since 1990, and they've tried to get more period furniture, and there's music, and there's a special tour you could take of the apartment. So it's quite a thing. So when I came with a group one year, I was in the studio of one of the artists, having lunch. And while I sat, we were discussing the world at that time. While I sat there, one of their friends, an artist, did a chalk drawing of me. And this is 1992. Now, when I look at it today, it's a wonder that he knew what I think it's a pretty good facsimile of me, what I would look like 25 years down the line. So he wrote Ihor Kuryliw Mecenat on the top left-hand corner, trying to reflect on the fact that I helped out the museum. And I did help some of these artists in different ways. While I was there, the first time, I noticed that they were attaching their canvases to wood frames with nails. Well, that ripped the canvas. So the next time I came around, I arrived in Lviv. I came with staple guns, so that from then on they could staple their canvases onto. So one thing led to another, you know, and all of a sudden I became a philanthropist in the Mecenat. So that's the story.
Do you remember the artist's name?
No, I don't.
Oh,
it's on the back of it, but you know.
And do you have any other things that we should have mentioned that you'd still like to mention before we conclude this interview?
Well, I did have another career, a short one, in between my university and going to OCE and teaching. While I was at U of T, well, okay, my summers, I should get back to it for a moment. I did go to the university here in Toronto, but the first 2 summers I went back home, and I did get a job with International Nickel. They were offering jobs to children of people who worked for the company for the summer to make some money, and then you carry on, whatever. So one summer I did work in the mine at 5,800 feet below level, over a mile. And the following summer I worked in a smelter where they melted the rocks. That was not a very good experience because the rock had sulfur in it. So as they were melting the rock, the sulfur would escape in the thing. So I breathed sulfur for a good summer. The third summer, in the meantime, while I was at university, I joined something called Canadian Officer Training Corps, CUTC, which was a militia branch of the university. And the summers I spent in Kingston training. First was basic training, then I became an officer cadet. And after that, I was commissioned as a second lieutenant and then eventually promoted as a lieutenant. Well, there was one year in my life where I didn't really know which direction I was going to. So after I finished my third year in Kingston at, it was called School of Signals, signals meaning communication. It was called, the place was Vimy Barracks, just outside of Kingston. Spent a year there as a troop officer in something called an apprentice program of the Army. So basically I was an administrator at that point. So then I went to OCE, and then I went into teaching. You know, the other issue I could mention, and it has to do more with my parents than me, but it was partly on my instigation. We have a Kuryliw Family Foundation at the University of Alberta in the folklore department. Bohdan Medvitsky, who was a folklorist at the university, I knew him here from the university, talked to me and asked me whether we had any interest in contributing any money towards the folklore department. I sort of thought about it, and I put the whole proposition together, and approached my father, and we sent over X amount of dollars, which was tripled at that time by the government of Alberta. So if you gave $1, the government gave $2 into the same fund, so it created a substantial amount of money. So it was a program dedicated to MAs and PhDs in folklore. Now the reason I made the connection with folklore, my father was a devotee of Ivan Franko's poems. He knew a lot of by heart, and he always thought that Franko was downplayed too much because, you know, compared to Shevchenko. But to him, Franko was closer to life. And Franko being a folklorist himself by background, we sort of put the whole thing all together. My father's interested in Franko, Ivan Franko, folklorist, make a bit of a wave in academic circles, and as a result, we have this fund at the university.
So that will be found online, and we'll probably give a link to it too.
Yes, it's online at, well, you could put Ukrainian Folklore, University of Alberta, and my parents' pictures come up with a little description.
Excellent. Good. Thank you for sharing your stories.
You're welcome.
So we're going to add one more little piece of information about your accomplishments in Sudbury.
Yes, you'll recall I talked about this business of dancing and singing and getting involved with the Ukrainian cultural aspect. You know, I did it in Toronto here at the university. One of the bigger accomplishments that I had, I think, at that point, was being involved with something called the Canadian Folk Arts Association. Now, this was an organization that was organized by Leon, or in Ukrainian, Lauko Kosar, way back in the 60s, where he saw there was an opportunity to bring together ethnic groups, as they were called, to sort of celebrate Canada in their own particular way. I became a member of the folk arts. Lauko asked me to see if I can organize one of these associations in Sudbury while I was there, and we did. And I think we had about at least 12 groups that were members at that time. Now, in 1967, Canada was celebrating its centennial year, and it was an opportunity to have festivities over the course of the year. And I had an opportunity to be the head of this or part of the festivities at that time was organized by the Sudbury City Council. So I was involved with the council. We met almost a year in advance, and everybody was involved with their different activities. And mine was the involvement of the folk arts. We did have several concerts that I could say I produced, and it's a lovely memory from way back when, especially this year, when I think back, it was 50 years ago that it happened.
Mm-hmm. Great. And I just want to add, Kusar's concept was what?
Well, to bring together the ethnic groups and to celebrate the fact that each one of them, while they were singing and dancing their own dances and songs, this was all part of Canada. And down the line, a lot of this will be fused, melded, and the Canadian theme will be all part of these themes.
Great, thank you.
Yes, in 1965, I had an opportunity to be an intern at an organization called Radio Liberty. This was a radio station that broadcast into the Soviet Union with so-called alternate facts about what was going on in the world. Generally speaking, it was not a welcome visitor into the airwaves of the Soviet Union, because a lot of the news was not what the authorities wanted the locals to hear about. As I said, I had an opportunity to be there for a couple months during one summer. It was an internship that Miroslav Djakovsky got for me, where I had an opportunity to work with the Ukrainian desk of Radio Liberty. They were, I guess, preparing people down the line to become members of the radio station. So basically, what they had to do was help me improve my Ukrainian. I would read into a tape, and somebody then would listen and correct my accents. I did have an opportunity to broadcast twice into Ukraine. And here we have a picture of Radio Liberty and mine in front of all the knobs. It was a good experience, and I had an opportunity to associate with probably about 32 different groups of people, because these are the languages that they broadcast into the Soviet Union. That I consider to be a good summer. Down the line, talk about at least 10 years later, I'm in the business, in the travel business. I'm in Ukraine with a group, and in Kyiv, the tour leader asked the tour members to get onto a bus. They were going to go for a tour of the city. And she asked me to get off the bus at a certain place, and said that I should go and visit the in-tourist office there, and they wanted to discuss future business. I got there. I was warmly greeted by this gentleman. Can't remember his name at this stage of the game. And he mentioned that, yes, we know you're in Blue Travel, your partner is Markian Kohut, and you're sending over groups to Ukraine, and how can we improve our services? How can we get more people to come? How can we get real tourists to come to the Soviet Union? I'm using the word real because most of the people were going to Ukraine to visit their family, and the only way you could do it is by being a tourist. Well, we sort of discussed in things in generalities, and then he got into a topic about me. He asked me how things were going in terms of the various organizations that I either belonged to at that time or belonged to previously. And he started mentioning names of people that I knew. And all he wanted to know is, how were they? He would ask them about their health. I was intrigued with this for about 5 minutes, and then I wondered what was going on. And I suddenly realized that this was certainly not interest business. This was KGB business. I sort of think about it, and they knew more about me than I already remembered. And the way they found out about these things was well, because I was active in the Ukrainian community. My name appeared in several newspapers over the years, and somebody was gathering this about me. And down the line, this was the time they mentioned my activity at Radio Liberty. Finally, somebody had reported that I was there, and they had made a note of it. Now, he didn't make a big issue of it, but the fact that he mentioned all these little details about my life made me very nervous. I basically would have not said very much to him about anything. The only thing is I felt I had to cooperate just a little bit in corroborating some of his stories because of family that I still had in Ukraine. And I was concerned that they might pick on them if I gave this gentleman a bit of a rough time. Anyway, that was one of the little items that turned one of my hairs gray.